if there was more time to discuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blunt.
Thank you.
Dr. Godson, let's just start right there. Why do you think I've got about 4 questions, so they don't need to be exhaustive, and I can follow up with more written questions later. And Mr. Watson, I'm going to come to you next. Why do you think there was this element of surprise? I mean, this is not new Russian activity in other places in the world. I think Mr. Watson said it had to start before 2016, but it does seem that the intel community, the U.S. government, the media is surprised that they have this level of involvement. You just said we shouldn't have been surprised. Why do you think we were surprised?
Well, I do think it has something to do with our culture, that we don't expect people to behave in this particular way. We've been surprised many times in our history, so I don't think it's
we expected to do it everywhere else but not do it here?
Well, we just are sort of surprised when somebody takes a concerted effort to be involved in our affairs. We know that sometimes this happens abroad, but we don't really sort of think this is a major tool or instrument that people use. And so we found ourselves surprised in the 40s and the 70s and the 80s and so on. And so I'm not too surprised we are surprised.
Mr. Watts, why do you think we seem to have been so unready for this?
One, our intelligence community has been over-focused on terrorism and the Islamic State, and there wasn't much resources or bandwidth to focus on it. The second one is our traditional methods for detecting and counterintelligence, things like active measures, are based on humans. We run spies versus counter-spies. Most of this influence came online. They essentially duplicated the old active measure system without setting foot inside the United States. I think the third part of it is the intel community in the United States is very biased against open source information, and they've been surprised repeatedly. ISIS, the Arab Spring, you can go back over the past 6 to 7 years. We worry a lot about security clearances and badges and who gets access to doors and does the break room have a shredder, but when it comes to the open source, we miss what's right in front of our nose. My 2 colleagues and I use 3 laptops, and we do this at our house. But for some reason, the entire Intel apparatus with billions of dollars will miss a tweet or a Facebook post that's right in front of them, but will be highly focused on this security system and these closed sources, which are super useful. But we've not changed that orientation in our Intel community.
Mr. Rumer, in Europe, do you think the interventions there were so obviously different that we wouldn't have caught on, or how do you see the difference in what the Russians have done, particularly in the last 15 years in Europe, and what they did here?
Well, there was an element of unpreparedness on our part. I agree with my colleagues. I would say that, well, I can speak from personal experience, and that is I just didn't believe that any one intervention, any one agent can swing our election across 50 states. I thought nobody in the right mind would try to take on the challenge of such expense and complexity. But then when you think about it more carefully, as we have now with the benefit of hindsight, if you look at the election of 2000, when the Florida vote was decided by a very small number of votes, when we now know some of the votes were decided, in some states were decided by a very small margin, you realize that, you know, a more sophisticated actor that has, as my colleagues have pointed out, years and decades of experience of playing in this field can actually aspire to make a meaningful difference.
Let me ask another question about that. I know the vice chairman mentioned hand counting of ballots in the recent elections in one European country. You said that the Russian intelligence services directly intervened. We don't have any reason to believe, any of you can answer this, that they intervened in any election counting system this time. I think we should be concerned that that never be allowed to happen, and one of our goals here should be to be sure we're protecting that part of the process. But when you said directly intervened in the elections, no indication, Mr. Rumer, of directly intervening anywhere in the counting of votes on Election Day?
Right. There are public statements from our intelligence community and law enforcement and DHS that our counting systems have not been affected. I can only go on the strength of that, and I fully believe that statement. But we certainly should be aware of that and concerned about it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Heinrich.